Welcome back to part 2 of our camper van renovation series dubbed the Ram Camp Project. If you missed part 1, you can go to our RV Education 101 YouTube channel to watch it. In part 1, we finished all the mechanical work making sure the van is safe for travel. Today we're starting on the van's interior by roughing in our 12 volt and 120 volt wiring and our hot and cold plumbing lines. It's important we get this right because after the walls and ceiling are installed, it would be difficult to add more wiring or plumbing. So the first thing we did is decide how the van's interior will be laid out. After we knew where everything was located, I made a basic schematic of the wiring and plumbing for our Ram Camp project. As you can see, I have made several revisions as to what will go where in the van, but I think we finally have it figured out. Let's get busy.
Mark always says measure twice and cut once. This is an important part of the Ram Camp build, so we want to get it right the first time.
To help determine where things will go and what wiring and plumbing requirements we have, I purchased an inexpensive computer program that allows you to design the van's interior and exterior. After several different scenarios based on measurements, we had a floor plan. Then I moved it from paper to the van to make sure everything would fit. I wanted to finish any welding on the interior of the van prior to running any wiring or plumbing. I welded some extra bracing in for the walls, and I welded part of the bed frame in the van. We're going to use this old gym locker as the overhead cabinet in the van. First step is to sand it and prep it for paint. Then I'm going to weld a couple brackets on the back, weld the other brackets on the ribs that come down the walls on the inside of the van so we can mount it, and then I'll put some screws into the ribs to attach it permanently so there won't be any movement while we're driving down the road. Now, if this was the exterior finish on an automobile, you would continue sanding with a lighter grit sandpaper. You would use some Bondo to fill in any small dents or scratches. You would do a final sanding, then you would prime it, sand it, and paint it. But since it's just going to be some overhead cabinets in the van, I'm sanding it with 120 grit sandpaper, and then I'm going to prime any areas where you can see metal through the paint so we protect that surface until we can paint it with the final color. After that, I welded the brackets designed to support our overhead cabinet on both the cabinet and the upper wall, and I welded a rear brace in to level and attach the cabinet to the van wall. With that completed, we started on the wiring. When you start a wiring project like this, you first need to determine where the 12 volt and 120 volt wires need to be routed, and then determine how many circuits there are and what the load requirements are. This is necessary so you can select the proper size power center for the job. We reached out to our friends at WIFCO to help ensure the loads are calculated properly and to make sure we get the correct equipment. Our plans also include an inverter with solar for dry camping. Our friends at WIFCO showed me the proper method to determine the correct converter size. The first step is to determine the total 12 volt and 120 volt amperage requirements for the project, which for ours added up to 50 amps. The first 20 amps are calculated at 100% for a total of 20 amps. The next 20 amps are calculated at 50% for a total of 10 amps, and the remaining amps are calculated at 25% for a total of 2.5. That gives us a minimum required converter size output of 32.5 amps. To determine the power center size, you look at how many 12 volt and 120 volt circuits there are, but you must also consider the inverter. We wanted to have 2 or 3 120 volt outlets available with the inverter, so WIFCO recommended either the WF8945AD or the WF8955AD power centers. We decided on the 8955AD because it will charge the battery faster than the other model. Speaking of batteries, we have an awesome 12 volt 250 amp hour lithium battery from Go Power. Yes, I said 250 amp hours. Unbelievable. And speaking of charging the battery, a great feature with this converter is WIFCO's new battery charging technology called Auto Detect. Auto Detect is a new patent-pending technology available from WIFCO. It detects lead acid or lithium-ion batteries and automatically changes the charging profile according to the type of battery it is. Lead acid, AGM, and lithium-type batteries all require different charging requirements. The way Auto Detect works is the power converter evaluates the charging cycle of a battery, determines the type of battery being used, and then chooses the appropriate charging profile for the best performance and maintenance of that particular battery.
So we're good to go with charging our huge lithium battery when we're plugged into electricity. When we aren't plugged in, we have this Eclipse 190 watt solar kit with a second Eclipse 190 watt expansion panel to handle charging the battery. And we have this 2000 watt inverter from our friends at Go Power.
We have lots of wiring to do in our Ram Camp project van. I have two concerns about the 12 volt and 120 volt rough-in wiring. One is to make sure we run wiring to all the correct locations and don't forget anything. And two is keeping the wiring protected from any possible damage. To deal with my first concern, I made a list of every 12 volt and 120 volt component going into the van build. Then I took a Sharpie and tape and wrote the approximate location of every 12 volt and 120 volt component inside and outside the van. To address my second concern, the plan is to route as much of the wiring as I can behind or alongside the metal ribs in the van and cover any exposed wiring with something that a screw or staple cannot easily penetrate.
Mark and I had a brainstorming session to think about everything electrical that needs to go in the van and where in the van it's located. My strategy was to imagine we were camping in our motorhome and think of everything that we use on a regular basis. So make your list and check it twice.
Our Withco Power Center will be in this vicinity, and we will be able to access it and the Go Power lithium battery and inverter from under the bed and from the back of the van. Using the proper gauge wire based on distance and amperage is important, but if your connections are not good, nothing else matters. We want every electrical connection we make to be fail-safe. For my electrical connections, I use these heat shrink wire connectors. They come in different sizes, and if you'll notice, they have solder in the middle. So when you put one wire here, one wire in here, they cross each other. Then you use a heat gun and you melt that solder, and the solder spreads out and actually turns that connection into a solid wire. So if you've never used them, they're basically just called heat shrink wire connectors. They work really well. Part of your 12 volt wiring that you need to be concerned with is also the automotive stuff before we put our walls in and don't have good access to it. And if you look at this mess right here that somebody else did, we need to get this straightened out. So Dawn, turn the key on and turn the left turn signal on. Okay, this is our first run of wire, so what I want you to do is take it through our hose, go up to the second hose, come through, and what we're going to do is come over to this 12 volt light. To the next hose. Okay, the only thing left to do is label both ends of that wire, and that's what's that for? Dual LED light. Yep.
Make sure you label every single wire, because once the balls are in, it's too late.
With the rough wiring completed, we can start on roughing in the plumbing. Our plan is to use a 10-gallon freshwater tank with a 12-volt water pump, a gray water holding tank, one sink, a small water heater, and an outside shower. The freshwater tank can be filled at the rear of the van and it will have a drain. The gray water tank will be located under the sink and it can be drained from under the van too. Here's how we did it. Okay, when it comes to plumbing the van, I'm going to do things a little different. Lots of times when you see a van conversion like this, they'll use like a 7-gallon freshwater holding tank and then they'll have a 7-gallon gray water holding tank, both located underneath the sink. So as you use the water, it fills the gray tank, and then you can actually pick it up, take it out, and dispose of the gray water. So in our case, I'm going to actually use a gray water holding tank that holds about 10 gallons of wastewater, and if my calculations are correct, I figured that I can locate my drain opening, cut it out in the floor, and then plumb an actual drain valve underneath the van. So when the gray tank fills up, all we have to do is go out there, connect our sewer hose, and drain it into a disposal station. So hopefully it'll go well. We'll see. Okay, now I'm going to mock up the plumbing system. As you can see, we have very little space back here to get everything installed. I'm mocking this up for two reasons. One is to make sure that the space I allocated for the plumbing system is going to work. Number two is I'm using PEX plumbing and I need to determine what type of fittings I need to get and make sure when the fittings are installed, everything will work. For example, I need to make sure I can come out of the fresh water tank, go into the water pump, out of the pump, into the water heater, up to the front sink, and of course then plumb the hot side. We're also going to have a portable shower here at the rear of the van that we can use with this water heater. I think everything will work, and this mock-up might save me from making more than one trip to the hardware store.
There are a few other things that need to be finished before we can complete all the wiring. The roof needs to be sanded and the rust repaired so it can be painted prior to installing any solar and the roof air conditioner. The sunroof leaks and needs to be repaired, and since we're painting the roof, this is a good time to paint the cabinets or going in the van too.
The roof on the van had some bad rust in the upper corners by the windshield on both sides. I found another van being parted out, so I went and cut sections of metal out that I needed to repair the rust on our van. Then I cut the bad areas of the roof out on the van and welded the patch panels in on both sides. After that was finished, I grinded the weld smooth and used Bondo to finish the bodywork and prep the areas for paint. To repair the sunroof, I removed it from the roof and cleaned both surfaces. Then I put new butyl tape on the sunroof's frame and reinstalled it. Next, it was time to tackle the van's roof. The roof had surface rust, so I sanded those areas down to bare metal. I sanded the rest of the roof to prep it for paint and sprayed primer on all the bare areas. Then I sanded the primer on the lockers. The next step was to mask the roof off, do a final cleaning, and paint the roof and lockers with 2 coats of the Boulder Gray base coat paint, followed by 3 coats of clear coat. Well, that does it for part 2 of our Ram Camp project. Join us next time when we install our Havelock wool insulation, our walls, ceiling, finished flooring, and wire everything to the power center. Until then, happy camping.